how do certain foods end up causing this immune cascade in the body that has them feeling like crap?
So I think the first thing that everybody should understand is when you're dealing with an environmentally induced immune problem, there are stages. So there is a pre-autoimmune stage, and there's 3 stages of actual autoimmunity. Most people who have several different parts of their body that aren't functioning the way that they think they should be functioning, or it's a significant drop from their baseline, are suffering from that pre-autoimmune condition, the environment essentially driving their immune system into a chronic inflammatory imbalanced state.
Yeah, and just so everybody's clear, environment just means anything outside of your body.
Correct.
It's the food that you're eating, could be chemicals that you're exposed to. Largely what you're talking about is, of course, food, but there's a whole host of things that are part of that.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, food is the biggest part of the environment that you're exposed to. I mean, you know, you're consuming food 3, 4, 5 times a day. Depending on what that is, that could be regular, continuous inflammatory exposure. So the reason we focus so much on food is, number one, it's the biggest part of the environmental conversation. And number 2, it's the thing that you have direct control over. You don't have a lot of control over the quality of the air that you breathe on a daily basis. You have some control over it, but not as much as what you consume, right? So that's why we really focus so much on it. It is the biggest piece of the puzzle, and it's the most movable piece of the puzzle.
So you were talking about these 3 different stages.
Right.
Yeah. So you explained the first part, which is this pre-autoimmune stage.
Yeah.
Right. And we're not necessarily talking, although it's related to, you're not just saying that, hey, everybody's going to end up with an autoimmune disease, even though autoimmune diseases are skyrocketing and I think are one of the fastest growing classifications of diseases. What's the estimate in the United States? Is it 80 million people?
Currently, we're at 15% of the US population with a known diagnosed autoimmune disease, but most autoimmune diseases have a latent period of somewhere between 3 to 8 years. So if you kind of want to back extrapolate that data, we're looking at maybe upwards of 25% of the US.
That's crazy. And what's the population right now of the US? Do we know?
Tessa,
can you Google that? I think we're like 300
yeah.
and something million, 331 million. So that's a lot of people that have autoimmune conditions diagnosed. And there's some people still to this date, magazines, media outlets, even some doctors that I see that will tell people, oh, we're just getting better at medicine, so we're catching these diseases. That's why there's so many people that have autoimmune, is because our medicine and access to medicine in the United States has grown, and that's why we're catching it. Tell us why that is not the answer, or at least definitely not the full answer.
It's very clear from the literature that that's not true. I mean, we have very robust data in the NHANES trial. If you look at the percent positivity of a positive ANA over time during NHANES, you see doubling of that percent population. And NHANES in that regard has only been analyzed, I think, back to 2015 at this point. So no question, there's no way to discuss this other than scientifically true fact that autoimmune disease is on the rise.
Yeah.
And only in the last 15 years, let's say, which is a very, very alarming time frame to experience something like that.
So something's been going on in the last 15 years, right? Something's been going on that's not just affecting people who have diagnosed autoimmune diseases, although you gave 2 perfect examples. Hashimoto's is one, MS is another, but also this other category of just people who just don't feel good on a regular basis. People who think that they're eating healthy. Something has been changed in the environment. It's not our genetics. Our genetics takes millions of years to sort of evolve, even in the smallest realm. But there is our epigenetics that are going on in the body, which is how we react to the environment. So what the hell is going on in the last 15 years, in your opinion?
It's all, I think, the majority happening in that pre-autoimmune category, which essentially, if you want to break it down to a cellular level, it's really the normal physiology and function of our entire gut environment and the immune influence from that are completely broken. The most important regulator of our immune system is a cell called the T regulatory cell. The T regulatory cell, we have different populations of them. There's a gut-dependent or gut-populated T regulatory cell, which is essentially responsible for the balance of what in my environment do I want to attack or not attack. So when you have, let's say, a food sensitivity, or you have a new adult allergy that you didn't experience before, it is essentially dysfunction of the T regulatory cell that brought that set of symptoms on. Also, if, let's say, you consume foods and you get brain fog, a runny nose, and digestive issues afterwards, it's essentially the environmental triggers that are pushing that Treg cell to imbalance that are responsible for that, if you really want to break it down to one part of the immune system. Treg cells, their balance, essentially is fed entirely by what they see as threat versus non-threat in the localized internal environment of the gut. And with so many people experiencing intestinal permeability, so much dysbiosis out there, so much constant exposure to chemicals, the Treg cells see themselves as under constant threat. And when they see themselves on constant threat, they're going to try to fight back. And the way they fight back is with a chronic inflammatory response from the immune system. And we feel like crap when our immune system is in a chronic inflammatory state.
Everybody's walking around overinflamed. Not everybody, but a lot of people, most people, they're walking around overinflamed. And it's because their body is trying to fight something. Inflammation is a tool, right? So even though we don't like these symptoms, brain fog, runny nose, these are all defense mechanisms. These are all sort of signals. These are all canaries in the coal mine that are an indication that some sort of localized inflammation or chronic inflammation is happening inside the body. And even though we don't like it, our body doesn't make mistakes, right? Our body is doing this for a reason, because it's under threat. Why is it under threat? Because our border in our body, which is our gut health, and is out of whack because of the foods that we're eating. Dysbiosis, meaning we have too much of the wrong bacteria, not enough of the good bacteria, and also the chemicals that are in the environment. But would you say, out of the ranking of all those, food still is the number one trigger for most people of their body being in a constant state of threat?
Yeah, it doesn't begin that way, I think, but it rolls in that direction. We probably have silent, ongoing injury to that intestinal lining for years. And then when there's enough permeability, then we start developing the food reactions.
I think that's an important thing that you mentioned, because we're not saying that, and you're definitely not saying that, this food caused this issue. You're saying that this food is part of the story of this issue, right? And the story started much earlier. And it just so happened that certain foods are more likely to perpetuate this issue.
Yes.
So we don't want to be demonizing foods. And I think that's where a lot of people in the traditional world of medicine, they get upset when they see wellness people, podcasts like myself, other individuals they see on social media, that they feel that they're demonizing foods, which causes a lot of food anxiety for people. And prevents people from nailing the basics. And sure, there is some misguided communication around that, right? But here you're getting a chance to clear it up, that we don't want to demonize a food. We don't want to just immediately say certain foods are bad or certain foods are good. You want people to understand how they're part of this story. So tell us, how for a lot of these people, when you sit down with a patient and you're spending an hour in your first appointment, right? Or your team is spending an hour meeting with them, and going through their history and asking them about early life experiences, what are you looking for to put that story together about why they may be feeling the way that they do?
I'll talk about my own story because I think it's very reflective of the majority of people that we see coming into the practice. So I was born in Los Angeles. My mom had me via vaginal delivery. She did breastfeed me for a few months, actually, I think almost a year. So did her best to try to help nourish my intestinal microenvironment, try to feed my immune system the correct things. But I got sick a lot as a kid. I remember very clearly a pink bottle of amoxicillin that just lived in our refrigerator.
Antibiotics,
right? And back then in the mid to late 80s, medical practice was, a kid's not feeling great. Here's a tablespoon of antibiotics and just keep doing that.
I'm an 80s
And
baby too, so I'm right in that boat.
yeah, I'm telling both of our stories at the same time. I remember loving that pink syrup that was sweetened and tasted good to me. But what those years and years of antibiotics were doing were eventually depleting my microbiome of their most essential members chronically over the course of 5, 10, whatever years that was.
Yeah, and the research has shown just even one round of antibiotics can destroy, and I'll link to this in the show notes, but I remember clearly at a functional medicine, Institute of Functional Medicine presentation, even one round of antibiotics can have a serious impact on the total quantity of good bacteria inside the gut.
Right. And this is no knock on appropriate use of antibiotics.
Of course.
If you have strep throat, you should treat it, right? The ramifications of that are not untreated are not good. If you have sepsis, antibiotics save your life. No knock on that. But I think in that era, we were very, very clearly dramatically overprescribing antibiotics. And that had ramifications. And that practice likely existed up until recently. So that's a huge chunk of the population that had that ongoing regular hit to their microbiome. Also coincided with a dramatic rise in the availability of industrialized food, fast food. I think my parents were doing their best, but they both worked full time, and we ate fast food pretty often, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And that's ultra processed, tons of gluten, tons of dairy, typically coming from food sources that are, monoagriculture, high pesticide exposure, very improper breeding tactics for the cattle that's used, for the dairy that's used in those products. It's essentially the cheapest way to grow anything that you're going to be consuming. So
Fastest and cheapest,
right? And probably chemically engineered to taste the best and be most addicting. And you pair that with somebody who has dysbiosis, and those Treg cells that are developing inside of my gut at that time are just going to be bombarded over the head over and over and over and over again, until they're essentially going to say, okay, whatever we're doing isn't working here. We're under continuous threat. We're going to recruit everybody here, and we're going to start fighting. And unfortunately, though that comes from good intent from the immune system, that inflammatory signaling propels the leaky gut and propels the food immune reactions to another level. And that's where you can start getting dedicated antibody formation to foods, and the inflammation just ticks up a notch. And people can have lifelong issues from that. For me, I had IBS and chronic sinus infections for a very long time. I was very fortunate that when I was in medical school in 2005, my dad was in the process of developing some of the first clinical applications of testing for these things, essentially the first food sensitivity testing. He had actually dabbled with it in the late 1980s and was bringing it back in the 2000s. And he ran his earliest versions of gluten sensitivity and dairy sensitivity panels on me. I came back positive.
Your dad's a legend in this space, by the way.
Thank you.
He like totally transformed, because one of the big problems was, starting off at the beginning of the podcast, is that most people would just have these allergy tests. And as we mentioned, there's false positives, there's false negatives in the way that we explained earlier. And then there's all these researchers that are on the cutting edge that are like, we need something better. Mm-hmm. We need to look for something different. And your dad was the main guy that did that in this field of integrative and functional medicine.
Yeah, I'd say he's the godfather of bringing leaky gut and food sensitivity testing to the modern world. And at the same time, also just continuing to push the now known idea that the environment impacts the immune system, that it's responsible for this spike in autoimmune disease. And we owe him a great debt of gratitude. I'm very proud to be his son.
Of course, you're a son. How much of your story was a driver in him looking for these answers?
It was actually his mom's story. So my dad just won the IFM Linus Pauling Lifetime Achievement Award.
Congratulations to him.
Deservedly so. I know I'm biased in saying that, but the man is a humble scientific genius, and he deserved it. He was driven actually by his mom's story. His mom, my grandmother, suffered from really debilitating rheumatoid arthritis.
Another autoimmune condition.
Autoimmune condition, but it did not kick in until her middle ages. And really, he has a really remarkable story about kind of watching this happen. They were growing up in Israel, and Israel was very much a developing country at the time, and she had some serious dental issues, dental cavitations, infections, and they weren't treated appropriately. She eventually had her teeth pulled, but without antibiotics, and my dad's idea is essentially that watching that happen to his mom was the triggering event for the RA, and we now know through his own research and several other people's research that the dental organisms of infections in the mouth are very much responsible for the development of RA in certain individuals.
And is that through the process of when these teeth are extracted, you have these cavitations, and these cavitations become infected, and that can, in a way, leak bacteria into the body? Is that the mechanism?
100%.
Okay.
Yes. And there probably was a chronic infection for that individual for years before it was ever detected. So it's the setup of the chronic infection, then the extraction event, and then the flood of the bacteria from the cavitation into the bloodstream.
Yeah, and it's not to say that you shouldn't have teeth extracted. It's just, looking for a dentist that understands to make sure that no living matter is sort of left in, and that the cavitation is completely sterilized before they go ahead and close it up.
Yep.
Otherwise, it's like taking a bunch of trash, throwing it into the room and locking it, and that trash ends up fermenting and attracting rodents and this and that. And that's how people get affected by these cavitations.
Exactly. So he essentially in real time watched my grandmother develop RA as the result of this dental infection. So he wanted to dedicate his career in immunology to shedding light on this, shedding light to the idea that, number one, the environment is responsible in the majority for the development of autoimmune disease. And then number two, mapping out what those things in the environment might be. And then number three, developing tools so clinicians like myself can accurately identify those things in our patients. And I'm very grateful that I have those tools available to me, because they are the thing I think that allows me to be a more precise physician when people come into the office.
Let's go back to your story. How early did you notice some of these symptoms that you were going through? I mean, you mentioned that you would get sick a lot as a kid. You gave us some examples, but when did it really start to get bad for you?
In medical school, early medical school, I couldn't keep up with the demands. I had a sinus infection every single month, like clockwork. I just didn't feel like myself. I couldn't concentrate the way I wanted to. I was having a hard time sleeping. And yes, medical school is stressful, but this was beyond that. And that's when he took my sample and said, you have a gluten and dairy sensitivity. This is 2005. Nobody was executing a gluten-free diet or a dairy-free diet. I mean, it was like, what are you talking about, Dad?
He was like, what the hell?
What is gluten? What are you talking about? So he said, listen, I know this is daunting. Do it for 3 weeks. Just do it for 3 weeks. See how you feel. And if you don't feel any better, I'm wrong. But if you feel better, then maybe you should think about doing it. So I followed his advice. I haven't had a sinus infection since. Obviously, he was right. And I feel dramatically better when I remove gluten and dairy from my diet. And I noticed the effect within a week. I was clearer. I was sleeping better. I just felt more like myself. And anytime I do have a little excursion to Europe and I try a little reintroduction, I get a reminder of why I removed them.
Two things on that story. Number one, congratulations. I'm so glad you aren't having sinus infections anymore. I had a lot when I was a kid, same situation as you, always on antibiotics, even with my parents coming from like Ayurvedic influence in our background. And they did bring in some of those things. They would bring in some of those things to treat like strep throat when I had it. But I was in this constant cycle of medication, getting sick, medication, getting sick. And my gut was irritated all the time. I remember even just as a young kid, having an aversion to eating sometimes because I just intuitively felt like I don't want to feel bad, right? I don't want to feel bad. And so I'm just not going to eat certain stuff, which made me both a picky eater, but probably not a good eater. So your story is obviously, there's themes of that are going to be applied to a lot of people that have food sensitivity, but there's also uniqueness. You and I were on a lot of antibiotics. Maybe for some people, they weren't on as many antibiotics, but it's also not just antibiotics. It could be adverse childhood experiences that people have.
Sure.
You know, you grew up with an alcoholic parent. You grew up in an unstable family situation, something that put a lot of extreme stress on you. You were sexually abused. Even these things have been linked to, you know, look it up, the ACEs study. These things have been linked to autoimmune conditions. These things have been linked to gut permeability and leaky gut as well. So it could be antibiotics, could be extreme stress. There is a friend of mine, Nishtha, who lives in the UK, and her daughter, crazy story, was in their teens. They went to visit, I believe they were in Dubai. They live in London. They were jet skiing, I think, and something happened and her daughter fell in the water, and she drank a bunch of water that also had like contaminants, like oil from like, you know, the area, I think even some bacteria. And ever since then, they didn't know it was that. She developed IBS. So you can have a few different things that can be these external environmental factors that come in and basically start to disrupt the system. But I just want to make sure that people are clear. You're not saying that for everybody, it's gluten and dairy, or that every single person out there has a gluten dairy issue, right?
These are the common
These
stories.
are the common
but
stories.
everybody has their own individual version of this. You know, what I look at as my task when I'm seeing a new patient is, first, what was the initial, like the most recent trigger for them ending up in this situation? And then also, more importantly than that, what was the road that they traveled to get to a tipping point? So both of them are incredibly important to identify. And the road traveled and the tipping point are both unique to everybody who comes into the clinic and unique to everybody out there.
Yeah. And that being said, it's not just gluten and dairy. For some people, there's other food sensitivities, same story, that they end up with. What are some of the most common sensitivities if you would continue that? Gluten would be maybe number one. Dairy would be number two. And obviously, there's a whole question about types of dairy, fermented dairy, other stuff that some people seem to be more reactive to and some people seem less reactive to,
Sure.
Me included, that I want to ask you about. What goes on from there? What are the other common food sensitivities that tend to make people stay in this sort of inflammatory loop?
The top 5 are gluten, dairy, corn, soy, eggs. From there, you can go further. There's a theme of different food proteins that cause this potential in the realm of agglutinins. Lectins are included in that as well. Things that have agglutinins are legumes. Lectins are carried in many different foods. But, you know, essentially top 5, gluten, dairy, corn, soy, eggs. From there, we go on to other veggies.
And just to be clear, some people could be more reactive to some and not reactive to others.
Absolutely. You could have somebody who's, you know, 9 out of 10 reactive to eggs, has no issue with gluten or dairy. It's not common, but it can happen.
How do those play into this whole other category? And my mom is a perfect example. Growing up, my mom would go, I don't know if it's every week or every few weeks, to go get an allergy shot, right? She'd go regularly because she would regularly have to take things like, what is it, Zyrtec, right?
Allegra,
Zyrtec,
Singulair.
Because she always had allergies.
Yes.
What's going on, first of all, for people who are in that boat where they're taking a medication like those mentioned, or they're getting allergy shots? What's going on in that category?
Okay, so first of all, 1 in 3 Americans, adult Americans, experience some type of allergic disease, be it asthma, allergies, or eczema. We are talking about a humongous number of people out there, huge. And then 1 in 4 children have an allergic disease. So this is not small numbers.
Crazy.
Okay, crazy. So again, the development of an allergy to something in the immune system can happen in 2 phases. Right? The early childhood form versions of allergies happen essentially during the development of the immune system in the first 3 years. Again, that thymic gland is responsible for programming T cells. In the thymic gland, we're programming those Treg cells that I was discussing earlier. If those Treg cells aren't programmed in the correct fashion, you can end up with allergies to things in your environment that you shouldn't have developed allergies to. Sometimes, they will persist into adulthood. Sometimes they will only exist during childhood. But essentially, that's the basis for those childhood allergies. It's improper programming of the immune system, improper programming of Treg cells in the thymic gland. And the gut is very much responsible for that. In adults, the Treg cells also in the gut, not in the thymic gland, are responsible for that development. So we hear stories all the time of adolescents and adults developing allergies, or maybe developing more severe allergies than they had before in today's world. And again, the T regulatory cells that are living in the gut are responsible for that shift. They are controlling the state of the most important part of our immune system, which is the adaptive immune system. And it breaks down to a balance of the different arms. One of them is called T helper 1, the other one is called T helper 2. So, in short, if your T regulatory cells are upset in a specific way in the gut, they will drive T helper 2 to be more powerful than it should be. It's called the Th2 dominance. And in that Th2 dominance, you're basically going to drive those IgE allergies that we talked earlier, because you're producing far more IgE antibodies to things in your environment than you were before.
So your immune system is ramped up. Obviously, how you grew up, stressful situations. My mom didn't take a lot of antibiotics growing up, but just lifestyle, eating processed foods, etc. Now your immune system is already ramped up. You get a little bit of leaky gut. That turns into a lot of leaky gut as you get older, because your body's not rejuvenating as much. And then certain foods can even trigger that further.
Correct.
And now all of a sudden, even though you never had an allergy to pollen, you're an adult now and you're taking Zyrtec or whatever and getting a regular allergy shot because your immune system is so ramped up that other things are also ramping it up. And for some reason, in some people, pollen could be one of them.
Correct.
Wild.
Yes. And what is an allergy shot doing in that situation? It's a really, I think, important point. Allergy shots, by the way, are nearly 100-year-old intervention. So what are you doing with an allergy shot? It's a long commitment. You're basically talking about spending your life doing some period of continuous injections into your arm. And what the allergist is injecting into you is escalating minute amounts of the protein that you're allergic to. And what are you doing essentially? You're trying to convince those T regulatory cells that are identifying that thing in the environment as non-self, aka harm.
This
and
pollen is
attacking
coming
them.
in. We're ramped up.
We don't like this.
We don't
We're
like
fighting
it. Attack it.
You're essentially trying to induce what we call desensitization. You're trying to convince that T regulatory cell over just repetitive periodic exposures that this is not harmful. And by starting with a tiny amount and just escalating, that's a way of trying to induce that desensitization. Does it work? Works for some people.
Works in the short term.
Sure, it's not a root cause solution, because everybody who does allergy shots knows that they need a quote unquote maintenance shot going forward to maintain whatever benefit. And they also don't work for everybody, right? So why is that? You're not addressing where the problem came from, or at least what a very potent driver of that problem is, which is, again, going back to the gut, those T regulatory cells, because of what you're eating, the intestinal permeability, maybe a lack of correct micronutrient support to them, they're upset. And as long as they remain upset, your tendency to Th2, if it happens to be that direction, is going to remain. So you can induce desensitization to the T regulatory cells as much as you want. You're going to be best off by addressing both the gut and doing something like that at the same time.
Spoiler alert around my mom. She no longer takes allergy shots. She's doing amazing. She no longer has quote unquote allergies to pollen and dust, which she would react to before. And a lot of it was because she got to a situation, and I got introduced to this whole world of functional medicine. We brought in a few doctors, not actually there to treat her allergies. This is a common thing that you see. You get a lot of people who come in And they're not coming to you for dealing with allergies. They're coming to you because they feel tired all the time. They're coming to you because they just got a diagnosis of Hashimoto's, but they're not sure what to do, but they've read that food can play a role. They're coming to you because they have now symptoms of IBS, and it used to be okay and manageable, but it's getting worse and they want to do something about it, right? It could be a whole host of reasons, those and many more. And when the doctor that I brought in to work with her, she had this magical moment after about a month, 2 months. I mean, this wasn't a long period of time. I think this was a long time ago, right? This is almost like 15 years ago. So I don't have the details accurate, but I know that she ended up skipping or missing an appointment for one of those regular allergy shots. And she was just noticing her regular maintenance level of stuffy nose, eyes, watering up during allergy season where we lived in Delaware at the time. It just wasn't as pronounced. The doctor didn't tell her like, hey, we're doing this for your allergies. We were working on some other stuff. Yeah. And she thought and brought it up, and they said, yeah, this is a common thing, and kind of we're walking through some of the things that you explained. They weren't as eloquent as you are, but gave her the big picture. And she said, well, do I still need these allergy shots? They said, look, if you feel like you do, go for it, but let's just see how this plays out. And that was the last time in her instance, obviously working with her doctor, that she ever took an allergy shot, and she hasn't taken Zyrtec or whatever she was on at that time ever again. And it feels like a miracle, but really it's supporting the body's innate ability to repair itself and start to quiet down the immune system so it's not as reactive. Yeah. So I want to come back to you and how you talk about this and how you work with it in your clinic, which actually is just down the street over here in Los Angeles. You guys are just right over here on Wilshire, right?
Yes.
Not too far away. Just name of the clinic, if you could, for the audience.
Yeah, Regenera Medical. We're on Wilshire and Federal here in Brentwood.
Awesome. We'll have a link to you guys in the show notes if people want to check you out.
Appreciate it.
Great team. Bunch of people that have been there that are part of my network that love you, love your team. So let's connect the dots. When somebody's coming in and you hear this story, right? A typical story, these early stressors or some major life event or something, exposure to mold in some cases, right? There's these early stressors, those create this environment where the gut is not healthy. They're dealing with leaky gut, and then they're eating certain types of foods that perpetuate, and now their body is in this inflammatory cascade, this inflammatory loop that's there. Because you are a person who both you're a doctor and you have all this clinical experience, but then there's this whole other side that you and your dad do research. Yeah. You're not just immediately going to say to the patient like, hey, you 100% are having this immune response. You'll also do testing, right? So what is a typical test that you might do to see if in this category where their body is reacting to certain types of foods?
I think this is where art and science meet in medicine. So the art part of it is, quite frankly, getting to know the person, taking an extremely detailed history from them, knowing how to pull a string and just be able to chase a path a little bit more and get the necessary detail. And there's a lot of intuition that goes into that too, to be frank. And with that information, I then say, okay, this is where I think our high yield areas of investigation are. There's no point in me doing an A to Z workup on you now. I've got a specific task. So I want the data points that are going to get me to that specific task as, efficiently as possible. So I'll tell them, based on your story, this is what I think is happening with your immune system. I'd like to confirm that by doing this: intestinal permeability testing, food immune sensitivities to these specific foods. Sometimes we do a full-blown immune profile where we map these Th1, Th2, Th17, and other cells because I need to really see how clearly imbalanced we are. And then other times I'll say, this is why I think this happened to you. I think it was this and this and this and this. And that was the long road that your car traveled on. It picked up a flat tire here, it broke its radiator there. Your brakes completely gave out right here. And then you crashed into this wall, right? Yeah. And my job is to basically do a reverse wind up and take your car back to its pristine condition. So I have to know all those potholes on the road. I have to know where your brakes broke down. So I will try to pick up those data points too. Did you have mold exposure in your childhood home? Is it potentially still impacting you, both your microbiome and, your intestinal barrier? Or did you, grow up on the East Coast? Did you spend a lot of time in the woods? Did you get a tick bite that you don't know about? And you've had this, chronic spirochete infection this entire time. All those things are important in putting together the picture of that individual and being able to lay out the personalized plan for them.
Of some of those tests you do, your dad created a couple of those tests.
More than a couple of them.
Can you just name them? And just to also be clear, these are not like a consumer can just go and order them.
Right.
Typically, these tests come with a lot of education, and they are tests that are made available to doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Any doctor that wants to go and get educated in this process and really understand. So for these tests that are there, what's the brand name that people might be looking for? Or be looking for a doctor that, implements these testing as part of their workup, in addition to the core foundation, which is just truly listening to the patient and having more than a 10-minute appointment.
Sure. So my dad is the chief scientific advisor for Cyrex Labs. All of the testing for Cyrex Labs has been developed and is produced by my dad and our team here locally in Los Angeles.
And they specialize in a lot of these sort of food sensitivity, but they do some other things as well.
Absolutely. So the core of Cyrex is definitely doing accurate intestinal permeability testing, blood-brain barrier testing, food immune reactivity testing. There are over 180 foods that can be tested for in their menu. But, knowing that my dad's passion is mapping everything in the environment that we know of today that can trigger autoimmune disease, it covers all of the bacteria, viruses, mold, fungi, tick-borne illnesses, all the chemicals that can be issues. And then, I think the other thing that my dad and I are very passionate about is in this realm of dealing with an autoimmune epidemic, we need the tools to be able to identify when somebody is in the earliest phases of this so that we can stop the process and prevent them from becoming one of the 80 to 100 million people who have a known diagnosed autoimmune disease. And you do that through something called predictive antibody and immunophenotyping testing. So what does that mean? In an autoimmune disease, the characteristic is essentially the development of an antibody against your own tissue. Depending on the autoimmune disease, that can happen for anywhere from 3 to 18 years before the actual autoimmune disease itself develops. That means that you've got this very large window for detection. So there are panels in Cyrex that are essentially designed to try to capture people in that window so you know what you're dealing with. And then the most recent additions to the menu are immunophenotype testing, which is the newest way to identify where someone's immune system really is. Again, looking at that Th1, Th2, Th17 dominance. And then there's a gut-brain panel also that is meant to be a tool for clinicians to identify when they might be on that gut-brain pathway to a neurodegenerative disease.
Yeah. And, just so everybody's listening or watching on YouTube, we're not here to plug Cyrex, right? They're a great company, and your dad's labs that he created is it completely changed the game. We're mentioning it because it truly is the best tests that are out there in this space. And also too, I personally believe, while there's a lot of really great companies that are doing direct to consumer testing and are trying to sort of navigate that space, and eventually one day we'll get there, there still needs to be, in my experience, having been in this space for a while, even though I'm not a physician, there can be a lot of misinterpretation on this data, and a lot of these tests are sort of stretching. And people are getting, no test in itself is immediately going to just tell you, do this, don't do this. You kind of need a doctor to know your story, right? Somebody trained in this world who can help you navigate this. Otherwise, you can end up in a place where you're totally confused and more worse off than ever before. So I just want to make that known. That's a lot of, in the beginning, I was like, amazing. Everybody needs to do these tests and do it from this company or that, or this one does it direct to consumer. And I've been a little bit more cautious, and I feel like working with the good doctor is a big part of making sure you don't go crazy in this process once you get back your results. And it's not just about the foods. And that's the next part of this discussion. For many people, not everybody, they actually might be able to eat some of these foods again that they were reacting to. Maybe they're not eating it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the case of gluten and dairy, but they can have some frequency, not everybody. And a big part of that comes back to gut repair. And if you're not working with a physician that knows the space, you're going to end up avoiding a ton of foods and never repairing your gut, and you're going to be miserable.
Can I give you the most common scenario that we see?
Please.
That, by the way, I completely agree. I hope that it's not always the case that this is going to be, rare to find a physician who understands how to interpret these testing, understand how to order them appropriately. This should be more available, and everybody should have access to this. Everybody.
Yeah, we need technology to help with this,
Yes.
AI, other stuff. That's the best hope of AI.
Yes.
Everybody's scared of AI, and I'm like, okay, look,
No.
we should have caution, but it's going to change the medical field and make all this stuff way easier.
If it means that everybody gets meaningful access to, let's say, what I do in my clinic, nothing but good things can come from that. Okay. Like the health of the nation, the health of the world will be in a much better place if that's the case. So I'm all for it. Again, you're doing immunological testing, right? So you're also getting feedback from the immune system about what's going on with it at the time. You can order a 180 food immune reactivity panel, and 100 of those foods can come back positive on that test. Somebody who is not familiar with what that means thematically to the immune system is going to look at that and say, like, sorry, Roger, your panel came back positive for 100 foods. We've got to remove everything that's positive, which is a huge problem because you're going to induce an eating disorder for that person. They're going to be terrified of eating something, and they're going to become micronutrient depleted as well too. That's not what the test is saying. The test is telling you in that situation, that person's immune system is so pissed off that it can't even make an antibody to one single thing anymore. It makes an antibody to everything. That's something called polyreactivity. And we know that people with severe cases of intestinal permeability and gluten sensitivity and or people with Epstein-Barr virus reactivation are very prone to polyreactivity. So somebody who knows how to interpret that test, and I hope more people do now after talking about it here, will look at that and say, you know what? We can't remove all 100 of these foods. That's not the right thing to do here. The right thing to do is focus on the intestinal permeability. Be 100% about gluten. Let's find out if you have EBV reactivity too. That's the way this data should be used.
Yeah, it's so important. Obviously, we mentioned your clinic is down the street. Does Cyrex, and knowing that they've trained they've been part of the training for a bunch of physicians that are out there. Some that call them functional medicine, but a lot of doctors who are just regular, quote unquote, conventional doctors who are starting to become really hip to this.
Yeah.
Do they maintain any kind of database of people that are out there that are trained in these tests? If somebody for some reason can't make it out to Los Angeles or doesn't immediately know somebody like you, do you know if they have a database of physicians?
I don't believe that they do.
Okay.
They should. We've brought it up to them several times. I do believe they're working on it. Cyrex is really a gold standard test in functional medicine. So I think that the chances are if you find somebody who is IFM certified,
Institute of Functional Medicine
certified, that they're going to know, Cyrex and really all the other tools that we should be using, stool testing, whatever it is. They'll know it pretty well.
Yeah. And again, all physicians are trying to do their best in this space, whether they're functional medicine certified or not. And one thing that's there is that it is a common thing with people who are new to functional medicine or integrative medicine. They get these tests and they haven't been doing them for a long time. They're coming from a good place, but they can induce a lot of fear and anxiety by just telling patients, just get off of all these foods.
Yeah.
And hopefully with training, they'll get better. But I do want to tell people, even within the functional medicine space, and you come from this space, and I hang out with a lot of doctors in this space and go to conference, you got to look for the right individuals that have the right experience. That goes for any category. Just because somebody's certified in this or that doesn't mean that they know how to work through, in this particular case, food sensitivity, which is really the ultimate end goal, is gut repair, right? And it's okay to ask questions and ask, like, how long have you been working with people in this space? How long have you been familiar with this test? You can ask, is there any other questions you might ask if people are interviewing or trying to find a physician in this space, specifically in this category of getting better from food sensitivities and repairing their gut?
I think number one, ask what kind of training they had. Like doing a full IFM certification, I believe is a really strong background. Me even coming from a scientific research background, growing up with my dad, was everyday education for me. The IFM training really gave me a lot of what I needed.
Yeah, and that is like you're fully certified.
Fully certified.
Right? It's
you
not
take
just
all the courses. You take
a lot of
an
people say
exam.
they're functional medicine doctors. They've been to one course. They haven't gone through the full certification.
Full certification.
Yeah.
So it's called IFMCP, is a fully certified practitioner with IFM. I'm an MD. I think that there's some things that MDs can do that nobody else can do. If you're dealing with an actual medical diagnosis like lupus, MS, Crohn's disease, whatever, you probably want to be in the hands of an MD. Naturopaths do incredible work. I have a nurse practitioner in my practice, Amy Donahue. She's amazing. She can do it all. Highly recommend her as well too. But it really depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Right. If it is, something that requires a deeper dive, make sure that it's someone who's been doing it for a while, is fully certified, and a higher degree.
You have one side of the debate that's out there, and it often ends up being many people that are on the plant-based side, right? Vegans, vegetarians, who feel like any talk about lectins and them being bad for the body is hogwash, and it's fear-mongering, and it's total bullshit, right? So there's that one side. Not everybody in that group, but that's a very vocal side. Then there's another side of the spectrum that's saying, lectins are the cause of a lot of it. And primarily that's, friend of ours, we don't necessarily agree with everything, but he's been on the podcast before, Dr. Gundry. And he may say that lectins are a big responsibility for a lot of issues. And what I love about your perspective, which is really the perspective of functional medicine, is basically what's your perspective on the topic of lectins?
It's all individual, right? You have to take the information and apply it to the individual. There is no, this is the problem for everyone. There is no, this is the diet for everyone. I'm sure that's going to offend the internet diet street gangs as it did last time.
Now you're going to have everybody attack you.
That's fine. I've got thick skin. But I think the most rational way to think about this is, what problem are you trying to solve with the dietary intervention? Okay. Let's say, for example, it's somebody who has joint pain and they've got a positive rheumatoid factor. I think to myself, what does a positive rheumatoid factor actually mean? It's not just a line on a blood test. It means something physiologically. What a rheumatoid factor is aggregates of antibodies joining to each other. So that's called agglutination. Very similar to agglutinins in food. So it would make sense to me in that context that if the person has immune reactivity to something in the lectin or agglutinin world, and they have a positive rheumatoid factor, they are the candidate for following a lectin and agglutinin-free diet. It makes sense in their context, right? Is it correct for everyone? No, right? Carnivore diets. Everybody on the internet loves talking about carnivore diets. There are definitely applications where a carnivore diet makes sense. Microbiome in complete disarray. You do everything you can to try to control that dysbiotic state. You're getting nowhere. They've got T regulatory cells, which are programming cells that help tip the balance towards Th1, Th17, which are the pro-autoimmunity immunophenotype. they're being driven by whatever the person eats. You can put them on pure autoimmune paleo. You can, do everything under the sun, but they don't respond to any of it. You need to just reset everything. Provide them zero fiber, zero input to the microbiome, let everything settle down. That's exactly what a carnivore diet does. Makes sense. Is it a long-term sustainable option for everybody on the planet and we're all ridiculous for not following a carnivore diet? No. Each diet has an application for an individual. It is the job of a seasoned and humble healer to learn who's the right candidate for the right diet.
And, the thing I love about functional medicine doctors is that it's not political for them in the politics of vegan, not vegan, carnivore, this. It's like, what do we need to do to get you to heal? So if you're seeing that somebody might have reactivity towards lectins, which actually was the case for me when I had a lot of my gut issues, and I would just notice it. I grew up on a primarily Indian vegetarian diet, and lentils were a big staple. Now, I'm so fortunate that my mom, from just knowing how to cook through traditions, whenever we would have a lot of nuts in our diet, she would always soak them at home. It just was part of our tradition.
Yeah.
Right? We'd use the pressure cooker a lot.
Yep.
Right? We would do a lot of things. And even though there was a lot of eggplant and there was a lot of tomato in our diet and a lot of peppers and other things like that, generally those things were either slow cooked or cooked in a pressure cooker. And in our tradition, I'm from the Gujarat region of India, stews are a big part of it. We call them shak or sabzi. And those foods would do really well. And when I got to college and I would eat a lot of those foods, I actually became vegan in college, and I would eat those same foods out, is the first time that I started noticing I had major gut disruption and I was not feeling great. And I just was like, I cannot eat Indian food. It just like totally messes me up. So I realized that I might have had a sensitivity before, but actually getting off of those foods temporarily. And then this is the question that I have for you. I was able to, over the course of a period of time, heal my leaky gut.
Yeah.
And I want to hear your top supplements, foods, other stuff, programs that you recommend for people for that. And then some of those same foods that I had sensitivities for, largely most of them have gone away, but some still remain. If I have a lot of it, I will notice that I don't feel that good and my gut is disrupted. I have distension, bloating. Is that pretty common in that experience, that once somebody heals their gut, there might be some aspects of those foods, in this case, we're talking about lectins, that people can enjoy in some cases, right? Would you say that you see that sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the standard, actually.
Okay.
That if, in functional medicine, we follow detect, remove, repair, 5 R's, whatever version of that you want to talk about. But the most important thing is accurately detecting what the problem is. What are the triggers of the intestinal barrier disruption of leaky gut, so that you know what to remove, right? So that's very, very important. Get that map out, whether you're doing it through an elimination diet or you're doing it through testing or, whatever means you want to figure that out. Get a very accurate map. And then you want to follow a remove and repair protocol for, let's say, at least 3 months of time. See where you are, and then do a reassessment. And, as far as what I like in the repair protocol, I think I'm thinking about this immunologically, right? So I'm trying to create a Zen state of the gut immune system. Again, that all revolves around those T regulatory cells and making sure that the barriers are closed. So I use a lot of Megaspore Biotic, spore-based probiotics, because I think they do a great job at the barrier and also with T-regs. I'm always using, a healing amino acid supplement, the basic gut repair stuff, something with glutamine and marshmallow extract and other demulsicants in them, just to provide the building blocks for restoration of the epithelial cell. I really, really like serum bovine immunoglobulins.
Yeah.
Right. So using a lot of SBI Protect. Basically, the way I think about this is 2-in-1. You're binding pathogenic organisms inside the gut and giving your immune system an opportunity to clear them slowly. So not using an antimicrobial to nuke the landscape, but picking apart, bad players in there one by one slowly over time. And again, the immune system lives on pattern recognition. When it sees large amounts of immunoglobulins inside the gut, it calms down and enters a Zen state. I really like postbiotics for that too. It's my new kind of favorite.
Like butyrate, things like that.
Yeah. Specifically tributylin or butyrate products, with that hard outer shell to make sure they get delivered to the distal small intestine and large colon where they're effective. Choline, cholic acid derivatives, TUDCA is another good example of that. And then pomegranate extract, urolithin A, is another very good postbiotic that works wonders as well too. So I'm thinking again, immune system. So I think, in the repair side, we used to just like bombard the gut with, more and more and more glutamine and more probiotics. I think it's becoming more tailored specifically to that immune dysregulation in the mucosal immune system and trying to push against that.
Is that protocol inside of the book? Do you have it?
Yeah, most of it is.
Okay, most of it's inside of the book.
Yeah.
Great. We'll have a link to some of those items as well, too. So those are some of the things that are helpful in the restorative process. I want to go back to testing for a second. Do you think that most people, knowing that most individuals don't have access to a functional medicine doctor, it's still quite expensive, unfortunately, because our healthcare system doesn't pay for it, right? It's the best return on investment that the healthcare system could actually pay for. Get people healthy now, spend a little bit more money, and save a lot of money later down the road. But
don't get me started on that.
Don't get you started
for 2 hours ranting about that. Okay.
So for most people who are not going to have access to a functional medicine doctor, they're not going to have access to some of the expensive testing. Are there some basic things that they could be asking themselves to see if they suffer from a leaky gut, intestinal permeability? Is it pretty easy for like a self-assessment for them?
Yeah. I think again, you need to look at how does your immune system function day to day? What is the intention of your immune system? It is to help you in your war against external pathogens. So how often are you getting sick? Does a cold last 2 to 3 days and you're, sick for basically a day in the middle of that and then you bounce back right away and you're good to go? Or is it, a 10 to 14 day butt kicking? I think those are really good telltale signs of how your immune system is doing. If it's a 10 to 14 day butt kicking and you're getting 5 or 6 of them a year, it's time to look in the mirror and say, my immune system is not doing what it's supposed to do. And my gut is the probable cause of that dysfunction. Let me do something for my gut. Give me 3 months of, time and dedication to this, and then see what immune system I have on the other end of that. I think you also look in the mirror and say, you're a human being that is very resilient. You have a very complicated, robust body that has a complicated immune system that can be rejuvenated if you give it the right input. So give yourself the honor of that 3-month period of time. You don't need testing. Okay. I think as long as you're going to buy into, I'm doing something for myself and for my immune system. And yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, it's going to be change, but I'm going to follow through this until I see what's on the other end. You definitely don't need the testing. So follow a good, clean elimination diet, Whole30, paleo, whichever version of it you want to follow. I think that either of those will do quite well for you. And, you don't need to take supplements either. Bone broth has plenty of great stuff for gut restoration in it. Plenty of glutamine and collagen and other things that are good for you. You don't need to take probiotics. You can eat fermented foods. And as long as you're dedicated to it and you understand why, you're putting that investment in yourself so that you see what you get out of that investment. And you see the follow through of that. I think anybody could do this at home.
We were talking about cognitive decline when we first started the episode. And we were talking about how a leaky gut often corresponds to a leaky brain and can play a role in cognitive decline, one of the aspects that are there. Because you work with a lot of patients that fall into that category and being, certified in the Bredesen protocol, any case studies that come up to you or any stories that you've heard of through your work with Dale Bredesen and that group, or just your work on your own, where somebody starts to repair the gut and they actually can think clearer. They can remember things better. Anything come to mind? Any stories that that you've come across?
For sure. I have the honor of having a very well-known female singer in my practice. I think she's in her 70s, but very highly functioning and still touring and still doing her thing and still gifting the world with her voice. But not only she, but also the people around her started noticing pretty dramatic cognitive impairment in her. So I ran a Cyrex panel, which is meant to be a gut-brain panel. It's called Alzheimer's Links. It has Alzheimer's in the title, but I think it really should be a neurodegenerative gut-brain axis diagnostic panel, and that's a mouthful. So they went with Alzheimer's Links. But, essentially, after the research that we did that was basically inspired by Dale and also Dave Perlmutter, looking into trying to identify the common things that trigger gut-brain axis disruption and then how to identify that disruption, that's the panel that we did for this individual, and found very clear gut-brain axis disruption, early markers of neuroinflammation, markers of neurodegenerative plaque formation, and food sensitivities, predominantly gluten for this individual. So, I think the tough part there is explaining that whole picture, right? It's a lot of information that the person on the other end needs to understand it, right? You are giving them information so they are empowered to make a difference in their life. They are going to take their ship and put it in a completely different direction. They need to know in what direction they're steering and why they're doing it. So it takes a long time, I think, to kind of tell that story. But once they understand it and they get it, they're going to be on board. So shared the story with her, showed her exactly what was going on, gave her that same protocol that's gut repair with food sensitivity, with the gluten elimination added to it, and then also put a couple of anti-neuroinflammatory supplements, things like resveratrol, membrane replacement therapy, which is PC, phosphatidylcholine. And 3 months later, she did incredibly well. And she's still my patient, still check in with her every once in a while, still, cognitively back to where she was a few years ago. Nobody notices any, change or loss for her. She's still touring, still going all over the place. And that's a remarkable change, I think. And there are probably millions of people out there who could benefit from something like that.
An inspiring story, but I love asking these stories, and I love all of them that are featured in the book because it gives people hope. Because as you mentioned earlier, these issues and challenges and diagnoses and symptoms that people have, they weren't created overnight. They've been building up for years, often. And because of that, people have habits that they've built up for years. And food is so emotional. It's connected so much to culture. It's connected so much to our sense of who we are, our childhood, memories, other stuff. It's actually, I've had a friend say to me one time, it's like, it's harder sometimes to have people change their diet than it is to change their religion. Some people you're going into, it's like you're trying to get them to convert to a completely different religion. And they're like, what the heck?
Yeah.
I'm Christian, and you're trying to tell me I should be a Muslim now, or I'm this, and I'm a Buddhist, and you're trying to tell me to be that. It's a whole ordeal. You're kind of upending their world.
Yeah.
But I think hearing these stories is important because people feel like there's hope on the other end of it. What do you think, in your opinion, are the top things? When I told you that I wanted to work with you to see if I had any major flags in my autoimmune panels, you said, listen, I'll work with you, but you just have to commit that you're going to do what it takes, because I'm not going to go easy on you. I know what creates health, and I know when it doesn't work. For the people it doesn't work for, what are the things that get in their way that prevent them with following through with the plan that you put together?
I think it's not understanding why they're making the specific interventions.
So the why,
right? And that holds them back from following it for enough time. There are plenty of stories of people out there who, again, like me when I was 23 years old, felt like a completely different person 2 weeks after I made a food elimination happen. But that is definitely the minority of cases.
Right.
The immune system takes years to go to a certain direction. It's going to take time to push it into the other direction. And sometimes we don't have the patience or persistence to allow our body to heal. And it's not that the path isn't correct. It is, again, the ability to follow it until it gets you to where it's supposed to get you to. And that's why I wrote the book, right? It's not like, if you want to Google, what diet to be on if you have autoimmune disease, easy, right? You're going to get a AIP cookbook and textbook, and you're going to follow an AIP diet. And, I think if you don't have that why, you're going to burn out in 3 weeks, because it's a tremendous amount of effort. It is a humongous amount of effort to make that lifestyle switch. As you mentioned, changing your religion, essentially. You're going to get questions from your friends. You're going to get questions from your parents. You're going to get your other doctors looking at you like, what are you talking about? This is, baloney. This is quackery, like everything under the sun. Everything around you is going to challenge your desire to make this change. So you have to push through every single one of those challenges and make it to the other end. And the why is the thing that allows you to push through every single one of those challenges. You're not doing it for everybody else. You're doing it for yourself. Right? And if you understand why you're doing it for yourself, you'll make it there.
And it seems like there's like a couple layers to the why. Why is the first part, which is what today's interview is, your book is, which is the education. You have to understand. That doesn't mean you have to be a doctor. I tell people all the time, and I'm so proud. And I have to tell people because they see I'm Indian, I'm hosting this podcast. They immediately assume that I'm a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you how many emails start off with me to, hey, Dr. Drew. And I'm like, hey, I'm actually proud that, number one, I'm not a doctor. Not that I wouldn't want to be, but that's not my path. That wasn't the journey for me. But I love sharing with people that I don't even have a college degree. I dropped out of school when I started my first businesses. Yes, my family always valued education. I always read. I did all these things. I'm a big fan of education. But this doesn't mean that you have to have an advanced degree to understand all this stuff. We're talking about basic pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. And actually, sometimes people are so smart for their own good that they can't understand this stuff. Mm-hmm. They focus too much on the individual little mechanisms of this and that instead of zooming out and seeing the big picture of things and tapping into common sense. Yeah. Actually, common sense is a huge part of what will help you on your path of healing and getting better. That's a lot of what functional medicine uses. So that's the first why, right? Is understanding why do all these things connect together? How is the body a whole system? And really that the body doesn't make mistakes. Everything it does for a reason. Mm-hmm. Everything the body does, even things that we think that are so messed up, like getting diseases, it does for a reason. The second why is, why are you doing this? What's your driver? What's the thing that you're working towards? Is it often wanting to be there? This woman that you're taking care of, this well-known singer, is it that she wants to be there for her grandkids or her community that so reveres her work? Is it that you have some sort of project or business that you want to start and you have to feel well enough to do it? I've had so many people that have stopped and given up on their dreams because they don't feel well. They don't feel like they have the energy. So understanding that why of why you want to do it, in addition to understanding the why of why all this is going down. Do you talk to your patients at all about that second why? And are there some questions or some nudging that you do that's kind of like a little bit of a life coach?
Yeah, it's very much like a life coach. And yes, I do a lot of nudging in that direction. I think that's something that builds as you build a therapeutic relationship with somebody as a healer. Right? Oftentimes the tissue box will come out as you start asking those questions. So you've got to be kind of, you have to create the energy to allow that to occur. Right. And, I think nudge more in the direction of whatever that why is. First and foremost, you deserve to feel as good as you possibly can. It's about, to me, a lot about self-worth, them being deserving of the health that is going to come at the end of this. And oftentimes that will kind of, project you into some of the bigger questions as to why they don't have the self-worth or don't have, the goals that they otherwise would have.
It's been a great conversation, Dr. Vojdani. Is there anything else, big picture, that you feel that we left out? I mean, I told you already, we could do 1,000 of these episodes. You live right around here. We can dissect we could do a whole episodes on just gum, a whole episodes on just the healthcare system and why it's so messed up in the context of leaky gut and healing from leaky gut. Is there anything else that you feel contextually is good to talk about for today's podcast?
Yeah, I think one thing that I want everyone out there to kind of understand is we talk about leaky gut as being one thing or simplistic or like, everybody has it, right? Like everything in the body, it's complicated. Like everything in the body, it has individual aspects to it. One person's leaky gut is not another person's leaky gut. Being told that you have leaky gut or have a test showing that you have leaky gut is the beginning of a journey, the beginning of a road. And, be welcoming of what that journey is going to look like. Try to understand what your next steps are going to be. And don't try to compare your path to anyone else's path. I put the stories in there, I think really, again, as you mentioned, to just show people that they're not alone. A lot of times people are having these thoughts or understandings about their own health and feeling like, they're the only one in their circle that are, dealing with these issues. So the world is a big place. Many people have gone through their own versions of the journey and have gone to the other end of it. So the stories are there to remind people that there are other people who have gone through this and have healed, but your version is your version.
Can I recover from lifelong allergies that I've been suffering from? What are your thoughts?
It's one of the most common things we see in the clinic because it's incredibly common nationwide. 1 in 4 Americans suffer from some type of allergic disease. So people typically come to the clinic for something else, let's say IBS or an autoimmune disease, and we see allergies at the same time incredibly frequently. And what I tell them is, we're going to work on what you came here for. And in the process of doing that work, rehabilitating your gut, working on your immune balance, your allergies are going to go away. And they never believe it. But 6 months, 12 months in, that's absolutely the case.
So there's a lot of nuances in this term, even allergies, right? So let's start off with just a little bit of clarification, and then we're going to go right into what are some of the root causes of these allergies. So everybody stay tuned. So just let's make a little distinction. There's allergies, there's food sensitivities, and there might even be some other things in between. And I think it's really important for the audience to understand this so they understand how to actually get to the root. So can you clarify some of those terms?
Of course. So 3 major categories when we talk about a dysfunction between the immune system and the interaction with foods. The first is a food allergy. Food allergies are, the classic one is a peanut allergy. You think of a child who has some exposure to peanuts and has a full-blown anaphylactic reaction. That involves the IgE part of the immune system, and those reactions will happen in extremely short time intervals, something from on the order of minutes. Typically we see those present initially in childhood and can persist later on in different forms. People also talk about food intolerances. Now, a true food intolerance means the body's inability to break down a product. Classic example there is lactose intolerance. You don't have the enzyme to break down lactose. Therefore, if you consume it, there are going to be some ramifications of that. That actually doesn't involve any immune dysfunction. That's a genetic deficiency.
And something that typically also people have from a young age. If you're lactose intolerant, you pretty much have lactose intolerance from a young age.
You're going to be born with it, but most genetic deficiencies they'll become more pronounced as we get older. So you probably have some lactose intolerance when you're born, and it gets worse as you age, essentially. People use that word intolerance a lot to mean that there is some immune dysfunction there. For example, gluten intolerance, dairy intolerance is kind of the colloquial way that we discuss this. But the true terminology is actually a food immune reaction. Sometimes we talk about that as being a sensitivity. Now that's a IgG and sometimes IgA mediated immune problem. Essentially what happens there is during our first several years of life, we're programming in our thymic gland what is dangerous to our immune system and what is not. In other words, self versus non-self. And part of the programming is obviously also being able to decipher what is food and what is an external threat. In other words, we don't want our immune system identifying food the same way we would identify bacteria, viruses, parasites. We need to make that distinction. And those are not part of us, but we need to be able to attack them or not attack them appropriately. Through the course of, let's say, what's going on in the modern world, we're finding more and more adolescents, adults, basically losing that tolerance, losing that ability to say, this food is not dangerous to me, and essentially attacking it the same way that you would a virus or a bacteria. And the immune system will use IgA and IgG antibodies to be able to mount that attack. So a very different part of the immune system than a food allergy is involved in a food sensitivity.
And increasingly, what I'm hearing from you is over the years, you're seeing more and more people that are suffering from this. So this is not something that's in our genetics. This is something that's happening in our world, in our environment around us, that it's causing the situation where, yes, it's food, but also people are more reactive to even things like pollen and other situations, which might have something to do a little bit with our gut health. Not always, but there could be some links there that we can chat about in a little bit. So is that what I'm hearing you say, that it's increasing over a period of time, that it seems more and more people are eating things that maybe in the past we would have tolerated, but now we're not doing well with?
Absolutely. The most extreme example of that is celiac disease. That's a full-blown autoimmune condition triggered in the intestinal lining by the consumption of gluten. Wheat products typically are the gluten-containing food that we talk about the most. 15 years ago, we had an incidence of about 1% of the population with celiac disease, and now we're up to 3%. So a tripling in that time frame absolutely cannot be explained by anything other than environmental change making up that difference.
So let's talk about, in that context of those three different things that you mentioned, right? You talked about a pure allergy, right? Somebody could have a shellfish allergy. They could have a peanut allergy. They could have, in some cases, I've seen people later develop allergies to other foods that are traditionally categorized, which is very specific. Then there's an intolerance, right? As you mentioned, lactose intolerance. Are there any other things that fall in that bucket of intolerances that you see typically that are a true intolerance besides lactose?
Not commonly. I mean, there are people who are born with the inability to break down certain amino acids, inability to break down fat for certain genetic reasons. But true food intolerances outside of lactose intolerance are actually quite rare.
Okay, got it. And then there's this big category that most people watching today who probably came across this video or podcast, they're dealing with, which is they're eating certain things and they don't feel good. And many of those people have gone to their doctor, well-intentioned, and said, hey, I think I have an allergy to X, Y, and Z, or I think I have an allergy to something. I don't know what it is. And they get a traditional allergy panel done from their doctor. Tell us, what is that panel looking for? And why does it fall short when it comes to this category of these sensitivities and this immune response that's going on in the body?
Okay, so there's two major ways in which a physician would test for quote unquote food allergies. The first, as you alluded to, would be a blood panel. Now, the blood panel is essentially going to look for the development of IgE antibodies to different foods or other environmental agents like pollen, mold, grass, whatever it is that you want to look for.
And IgE stands for?
It's immunoglobulin E. So that is the part of the immune system that triggers an allergic response. Essentially, the formation of that antibody leads to the allergic response to the presence of whatever it's formed against in the environment. So if you have an IgE allergy to peanuts, you get an exposure to peanuts. That's what drives the immune system to have that anaphylactic reaction.
So part of that would be a blood test. Is that also when you see classically sometimes people come back from the doctor's office and they have a prick test? Is that another version of these tests?
That's another version in theory of doing something similar to that. So the second way that physicians typically try to confirm allergies is a prick test. Now, what is a prick test? You're basically putting a minute amount of the actual allergen itself on these tiny needles, piercing them through the skin where they have exposure to the surveillance cells of the allergic immune system, which are called mast cells. And once they penetrate the skin, then the body can form the IgE allergies. And if you get a hive or a welt or something in that location, the physician will say, well, you have an allergy to whatever was on that needle. There are issues with that test in particular. Just in general, if immunological testing is going to be accurate, that thing that is either inside the well for a blood test or the antigen that is on the tip of that needle needs to be pure, and it needs to mimic what is actually out there in the real world. So a lot of times with commercial testing, whether it be blood testing or prick testing, we're using industrial synthetic versions of the environmental antigen because let's say the alternative to this is taking a large concentration of a tree pollen and extracting the protein out of it and then putting it on the needle tip. That's very expensive. That's very cumbersome to do. So, using synthetic versions are far more efficient, but they are not the same thing as what's out there in the environment. So it's difficult to draw 100% one-to-one conclusions that the reaction in the skin or the reaction in the well is entirely the same thing as what that human being would experience in the real world.
So some people could have an allergic reaction to pollen and they live in Texas.
Yeah.
And because the pollen they're regularly exposed to might be different, it's actual real life, real world pollen that's there, but they got their testing done. And the synthetic that they were exposed to in, for example, a prick test, and in a blood test, they're also exposing the blood to a synthetic in a tube. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. So they take your blood, they expose it to something, pet dander or pollen or this thing or that thing, whatever, mold. But what you're saying is that there could be a gap because it's not exactly the same. So you could still have an allergy towards something or an immune response, which is a little bit different. Allergy is still an immune response, but there's obviously a spectrum of immune responses that you're talking about earlier. And so those tests are not perfect, but they give some people some insight.
Yeah, again, I think probably the most meaningful information that's going to come from a traditional allergy test is thematic information about where that person's allergic immune system is, right? So if you see thematically lots of reactions to things on the prick test, in other words, that individual just becomes one big red hive after they have that test performed on them, you're going to say, hey, your mast cells and your allergic immune system are really pissed off right now. Maybe you can't draw one-to-ones about what did it, but overall that part of your immune system is not happy. It's not balanced. Same thing with the blood testing. You can get that thematic information. But the most important thing I think also is to remember that when you're doing an allergy test, you're only gathering information about food allergies. IgE. So, the watery, itchy eyes, the swelling of the throat, skin reactions. And again, these would happen in the order of minutes following the exposure.
It's an immediate thing. You eat something, you're having an immediate response that's traditionally detectable through these things that you mentioned,
right?
Watery eyes, other stuff. But you could also have, there's foods that I eat, which we'll get to in a second, and you too, that when I have them, especially in a large amount, I get a runny nose.
Yeah.
But that food has never showed up for me in a traditional IgE test, in a traditional test. So this whole other spectrum, remember, there's three. There's traditional allergies, there's intolerances, and there's sensitivity. They're not showing up for me, these foods, on an allergy test. I'm not having an intolerance to them. But there's this whole food sensitivity thing, which I've done some labs that give me some indication that these foods may not be the best foods for me. Doesn't mean that I can't have them ever. There might be some people that can't have them ever, and we'll talk about your story, but that's the whole mystery that unlocks this food allergy, quote unquote, equation and can help people eat better in a way that doesn't make them feel like they just don't feel good. So going back to what you mentioned, there still can be things and times where you eat foods and you don't feel good, but it's not showing up on an allergy test.
Right. So that's what we talk about in the public realm as being a food sensitivity. The medical term is a food immune reaction, whereas an allergy is mediated by immunoglobulin E or IgE. The food reactions are mediated by a completely different compartment of the immune system, and the antibodies are IgG or IgA. That's why an allergy test would never pick up a food immune reaction or sensitivity.
Just to bring this up here, to tie this back to the first question, as people are following along and you're understanding and you're building a map of this world, in this category of food sensitivity, can you get better? And can some of the symptoms of eating certain foods and feeling extremely tired or a runny nose, a headache, can those things get better? Can you get better from a food sensitivity?
Yes. You absolutely can. Once you have correctly identified what the, I think, root of the problem is, which is in general going to be intestinal permeability plus food immune reactions. And we begin the healing process by removing the offending organisms and then repairing the barrier. People absolutely can get better from it.
Awesome. And we're going to walk people through that whole process. So coming back to and closing and putting a little bow tie on the tests that are there, whether they do blood test or prick test and traditional allergy testing, just to connect the dots for everybody, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't get these tests, because from what I'm hearing from you, you're really looking for two things. Number one, if you have a strong reaction to something, you probably have an allergy to that thing, right? That's number one. Number two is that if you have a lot of reactions to different things, that also can give you some information that, whoa, your immune system shouldn't be this reactive to everything. Something deeper is going on, and that deeper thing, spoiler alert, has something to do with your gut health. We're going to break that down. Would you agree with those two statements?
That's completely accurate.
Okay, great. So it's not that we want to, a lot of people say, well, my doctor ordered me this allergy test. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Great, especially because those tests are typically covered by insurance. If you've never done one before, it could be helpful, but understand there's both possibilities of false positives and false negatives. You have to understand that test in context. And unfortunately, well-intentioned doctors that are running this may not be aware of this whole world of food sensitivities. So they would tell you, no, you're fine. Just keep on eating anything you want. You scored nothing on this test. Meanwhile, all these people are running around like, I don't feel fine. I feel sluggish. I feel brain fog when I eat certain things. I feel like my face gets more redness, which is something that happened to me eating certain foods. So just understand these things in context, that it could be helpful, but there are false positives, false negatives, but here's how they could be helpful. Extreme reactions, and also if you react to a lot of stuff, then you have to start digging deeper for answers. Now, let me ask you, when you Google, a lot of people are Googling, especially with the topic of a few years ago, a lot of people were talking about gluten sensitivity, and the whole gluten-free movement was taking off. And there was good things that came from that, and there was not bad things, but things that were a little bit misguided. Everything was being labeled as gluten-free, that was gluten-free. And a lot of people were just thought that gluten-free immediately made something healthy, right? But obviously you can have gluten-free Skittles, you can have gluten-free candy, this, that. And in that process, a lot of people were Googling, do I have a gluten sensitivity? Because the word sensitivity started showing up more. So you started to see CNN, Fox, all these media outlets, Harvard, this place, that, all these institutions, media outlets saying to people, a lot of the advice was, if you don't have celiac, which can be tested for, right? Even that test has to be interpreted a little bit, but generally most doctors can test for it now. Yes. There's awareness. This whole idea of gluten sensitivity is bullshit, right? Don't bother with that. It's all marketing. It's all, wellness trends. Don't bother with it. If you don't have celiac, you don't have a gluten sensitivity. I'm using this example because gluten-free probably was the most popular one, next to maybe dairy, right? And people Googling, do I have a dairy sensitivity? So help us understand why were so many people, and people who seem very accredited, And big institutions, why were they telling everybody that this whole idea of sensitivity and gluten sensitivity was bullshit, and then tell us how you look at it?
Well, I guess the only way to kind of have that discussion about why there was so much pushback against this growing awareness in the public about how food is impacting the way they feel is that medicine in general is very resistant to change and very resistant to new information. I think some people argue that maybe that's necessary because when you're treating human beings, you need to vet things. You need time essentially to vet what's real and what's not real because science is a malleable process. I guess that's probably the nicest way to say that that's why there was so much pushback. Since then, there have been a number of articles that have absolutely, kind of concretely proven that a different version of gluten sensitivity other than celiac disease exists. Now, we call that non-celiac gluten sensitivity, NCGS, in the medical literature. But, I think probably the thing that we see in clinical practice in the functional and integrative medicine world is, bread and butter. Somebody comes in with Hashimoto's, you do a gluten sensitivity panel on them. They show up as positive on the gluten sensitivity panel. You remove gluten for them and their TPO antibodies will drop almost immediately and their thyroid function will improve. And that has been shown now in clinical studies in the medical literature to be true. So we know that this exists. There's no question about it. When you look at numbers in the population, upwards of maybe 10% of the US population has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It's not a small number of people out there. So I think that essentially, despite the pushback from the medical establishment when this information was coming out, and this is also beginning in the early 2000s, it's been a long time. We're talking about 24 years since Alessio Fasano first published his initial paper on leaky gut.
Can you talk about him just for a quick second?
Oh, sure.
Who is he? Where did he come from? And how did his work sort of change the medical understanding for physicians that were paying attention, right? Just so everybody's clear, I have a lot of physicians in my family. You are a physician. You have a lot of physicians and people in the medical world in your family. Physicians are well-intentioned, right? Just like most people are well-intentioned. Sure. Are there bad anything in any kind of group? Of course, there's going to be bad teachers. There's going to be bad this, bad that. That's a small percentage of people that are not well-intentioned or are malpractice or this or just, whatever. And they largely are practicing medicine based on how they were trained. And for a lot of physicians, like how long ago that you were in medical school?
Started in 2004, finished in 2008, so 15 years ago.
That's 15 years ago, right? So a lot has changed in the last 15 years, especially when it comes to certain cutting edge topics, especially this. And outside of drug reps visiting people's offices or a physician's own interest, of course, there's continuing education credits and other things that you have to stay on top of to keep your boards active and other things, but it's usually not the most cutting edge thing. And which isn't just, hey, what is this wellness influencer doing or that? It's actually dissecting the latest papers.
Yeah.
So Alessio Fasano, who is he? And how did he change this whole approach of food sensitivities, at least in one big category, which is related to gluten?
So I'll start off with saying I have great admiration for him. I think what he discovered and what he pursued afterwards absolutely changed the current state of medicine. So Alessio is a pediatric GI, very brilliant guy. He's from Italy, extremely charming, has written a great book, by the way. He was investigating causes of third world mortality and morbidity. Because he's a pediatric GI, he was focused on kids that were dying. He was investigating cholera, which is a bacterial infection. Cholera kills kids in third world countries by causing a water wasting enteropathy. What that basically means is their digestive tract gets so destroyed that they just are pooping out water to the point that they become so dehydrated that they die. He wanted to know how cholera had the ability to do that. Presumably, bacteria have that ability to do that to us by having a specific toxin that can do something. So he isolated the toxin, a candidate for the toxin, from cholera. Didn't know what it does. Gave it to monkeys, and immediately saw that the monkeys developed a water wasting enteropathy. So he said, aha, I found it. This is it. This is the cholera toxin. So he wanted to find out exactly, how does this toxin do this? How does it disturb the gut so much to the point that you're just losing all of your water through the GI tract? So he gives it to monkeys again, looks at their intestinal tracts post-mortem under electron microscopy, and essentially finds that their tight junctions of their small intestine are completely open.
And just to clarify for the audience that doesn't know about this, tight junctions, little sort of tangent on that.
Small intestine, for simplistic discussion, is essentially lined by a single cell that are called epithelial cells. Very similar in function and structure to what you have on the outside of your skin. The inside of the small intestine has a single layer of that separates food, bacteria, the microbiome on the inside, and blood on the other side. So this is a very, very vital interface for us, a place where we interact with our outside environment internally, and there's literally a layer of cells that protects you from that internal environment. So to keep that single cell layer from being able to, perform its probably most vital function, which is to serve as a wall, they're glued together essentially. But they can't be glued together in a permanent fashion, because then you would never be able to pull nutrients in when you want to. You would never be able to send an immune cell across the wall to the other side to find out what's there and then be able to come back in. So we have these malleable gates, if you want to think of them that way, called tight junctions that are just in between the epithelial cells. And at the time, we didn't know this. But through Fasano's work, essentially what he found was the cholera toxin artificially opened that gate and kept it stuck open. And with an open gate in between epithelial cells, the body can't keep what's called a hydrostatic balance, and you just flush water in, because also the immune system thinks it's under threat. So it's trying to get rid of whatever is causing that severe injury.
Hence why animals and human beings all get diarrhea when they are exposed to certain things. The body feels like it's under threat. And diarrhea, which we think of as a bad thing, is actually a defense mechanism that the body's trying to just get rid of everything inside to flush the system.
Exactly. So Fasano basically finds that cholera causes this by essentially creating massive leaky gut. Okay. Now, we knew in the medical world that leaky gut existed, but the only context in which we really knew that leaky gut existed was in celiac disease. And that was almost 100 years worth of data at that point in 2000. The idea that leaky gut could exist outside of celiac disease, not something that we knew or accepted in the medical literature. That didn't deter him, okay? So the next thing he did was a mouse study, and he gave mice what he now called zonula occludin toxin. That's the name he gave the cholera toxin, ZOT. Why zonula occludin toxin? Because those are the proteins that make up the tight junction, and that's what the toxin is interfering with. So zonula occludin are the proteins that they mess with. So he gives mice ZOT. The next thing he knows, a couple weeks later, those mice develop type 1 diabetes.
Wow.
Huge, huge discovery. Now we're talking about doing something to the gut of an animal and inducing a systemic autoimmune disease for them.
Yeah. And just to be clear for everybody, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition.
It is an autoimmune condition characterized by the destruction of the pancreas by the immune system. So you have something changing the environment and normal physiology of the gut, and the next thing you know, the systemic immune system is attacking an organ, something that it is designed under no conditions to do. It's the cardinal sin of the immune system.
Yeah. And bear with us here, because all this connects, right? This all comes back to food allergies and why people feel shitty sometimes when they eat certain things. Even if they don't have type 1 diabetes, we're laying down the groundwork so that you understand how this is all connected.
This story is probably the most important one I think in modern immune understanding, honestly, not just functional and integrative medicine. The whole medical community should know this story. Okay.
Please continue.
So Fasano is bright enough to understand the implications of this, because a gut-driven systemic autoimmune disease is groundbreaking. So first he wants to know, does this happen in human beings with autoimmune disease? So he takes patients with celiac disease, the most likely group of people to have intestinal permeability. And he does a study and confirms that they have a much higher incidence of having intestinal permeability. How does he measure for the intestinal permeability this time? By looking for the decoupling of zonulin from the tight junction into the blood. So essentially, he has now gone 2 steps. Confirm that a gluten-induced autoimmune disease has a leaky gut problem, and confirm that you can test for that leaky gut problem with a blood test. Okay. Next study, adults with MS. So he took
another autoimmune condition,
this time the brain. We're not interested in the gut anymore because that seems pretty clear. So he wants to confirm, does intestinal permeability, the thing that he did to the mice, can that result in an autoimmune disease elsewhere? The brain is very far away from the gut. So he took MS patients. There's 2 subtypes. There's a spontaneous progressive subtype of MS where essentially they unfortunately just keep going and going and going. There's another subtype called relapsing remitting. So these are people who have MS flares and then have periods of time where their MS is completely quiet.
Right. And in traditional medicine, they don't know why. Why are you having these symptoms? And all of a sudden they seem to disappear.
Correct.
And then you have them again.
Correct. Exactly. So in the subgroup of relapsing remitting MS, when they were actively in a flare, the zonulin levels, therefore their leaky gut, was extremely elevated. Versus relapsing remitting MS in remission, the same levels of zonulin as the control group.
So just to link this back to his original studies, right? He was able to create sort of this diarrhea in apes, for example, and he identified, this methodology of doing it, and also seeing that these zonulin levels were high.
Yes.
Right? So it's like, okay, this is correlated with them not feeling good, but then also in these type 1 diabetics, same situation of this zonulin being high, that could be in the mice, right? It was a mice trial.
Yeah.
When the zonulin was high, he was able to induce this autoimmune condition, type 1 diabetes. And now he's continuing that thread to see same sort of situation in the MS, at least in one category of the MS.
I'm gonna summarize it one more time because it's
Please.
really, really important. So the first thing he discovers is leaky gut is real.
Yeah.
That's what he discovers when he extracts the toxin from cholera.
Like it's an actual medical thing that's going on in the body.
Yes. All the literature, even for 10 years or 15 years after that discovery, said that's bullshit. But he discovered concretely that leaky gut is real. Number 2, leaky gut is controlled by a protein called zonulin. Number 3, leaky gut can cause an extra-intestinal autoimmune disease. Huge discovery. Gluten consumption is tied to leaky gut, and zonulin, and we can talk about, how we have gone a step beyond this in research since then, but zonulin is a reasonable marker for leaky gut, meaning you don't have to do a small intestinal biopsy on human beings to prove this. And then since then, several studies showing that gluten is one of the biggest triggers in the environment for inducing leaky gut via zonulin. So that's where we got to the point of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. What happens to those individuals is they're consuming gluten, their immune system is reacting to it, they get a zonulin release, and they induce intestinal permeability. A small version of what cholera does, essentially, a minute version, but one that could happen day after day after day after day if that human being doesn't know that it's happening to them.
Yeah, and to take this back to the question that I had asked you about why do so many what seems to be well-established individuals, institutions, and obviously the press sort of quoting them, say things like, hey, gluten sensitivity is bullshit. And even before Alessio's work, there was studies that were out there that were pointing out different things, but he concretely connected the dots. So if somebody's still saying that, it's either, I don't love this word, but it's misguided information. I don't want to say misinformation, but it's misguided information that is just related to they're not aware of that work that's out there.
Not up to date on the literature, I would say, is the right way to discuss somebody who's not aware of this at this point.
And so tell us, before I talk about, you mentioned something really interesting. You mentioned for example, somebody comes to your clinic. Let's say classically, it might be a woman who's dealing with Hashimoto's, because 80%, I think 90% of Hashimoto's cases are women. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's a woman, maybe in her 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, who's been either diagnosed with Hashimoto's or is starting to maybe Google and sees that they have symptoms that might be related to Hashimoto's, and that they come in, and then through advanced lab testing, they find out that one of the things that might be playing a role is that they have, in this case, they've been eating a food their entire life that they didn't know is agitating and encouraging their Hashimoto's symptoms. It's not that non-celiac gluten sensitivity or just gluten sensitivity is causing their Hashimoto's. I don't think we're at that place where we could say it's directly causing, but it definitely seems be one of the big factors for many patients that's influencing it. Is that a way to say it?
Yeah, it's a big chunk of their pie of how something like that happens.
Right. Of course, stress plays a role, other things play a role, but in this particular case, what are some other examples of chronic diseases that people are dealing with every day that even if it's not gluten, that it could be other foods that are out there that they're in this category where they are dealing with the food sensitivity and they may not know that that food sensitivity could be potentially a big chunk of why this chronic disease is there in the first place, or why they have really bad symptoms from this chronic disease.
Number 2 most established in the literature beyond Hashimoto's is multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis is not typically gluten. So the target antibodies, the target tissues in multiple sclerosis are myelin basic protein or myelin oligodendrocytes. They have what we call significant cross-reactivity with the dairy protein casein. What does cross-reactivity mean? The immune system is not a perfect system. When it recognizes things to attack, it does so with maybe 70 or 80% specificity. If there is another protein in the environment that looks that 70 or 80% similar, it essentially cannot tell the difference between the two of them. That is the case for myelin basic protein, myelooligodendrocyte targets. Essentially, they look extremely similar to the immune system as dairy protein. So if an individual with known diagnosed MS has a food immune reaction to dairy, the consumption of dairy will drive the antibody formation against their neurological tissue. Put that in a different context. If that person takes dairy out of their diet, their immune reaction against their neurologic target tissue is going to drop and they are going to feel better.
Hey YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
We don't want to burn things unnecessarily. For example, burning candles. So they're just trapping in a lot of these toxins that we're creating that don't need to be there.